Okay, this is about my experiences in World War II. When the war started, or actually in 1942, I turned 18, and I can remember my father saying, "There's a war coming along and you're going to be in it." And he suggested at the time that I try and get into this new branch, the Air Corps, which was strictly airplanes, and it turned out we were the ones that dropped all the bombs on the Germans and the Japanese. But anyway, when I was 18, I was a freshman in college. I enlisted, and about 2 months later, I was called up. And like most kids, the first time they're away from home, they have a homesickness period, which I did, but I did it at college. So when I actually went into the Army, was sworn into the Army in Columbus, Ohio, and went by train to San Antonio, Texas, to the pre-flight training program. That's where I was really away from home in the Army, 18 years old. But I really never was homesick because I'd already had that homesickness when I was a freshman in college. But anyway, in 1942, we were not doing too well in the war, and we were in the process of really creating an Air Force. We didn't, in fact, in those days, it was called the Army Air Force, or the Army Air Corps. We didn't have the blue-gray uniforms they have today and the reversed upside-down stripes, but everything was in the Army. And we were like the Signal Corps Division or the Corps of Engineers. We were the Air Corps. And all the planes we had, with the exception of the one that the Navy had, were under the direction and control of the Army. And we had a 4-star general named Arnold, Hap Arnold, and he was the head of the Air Force, or the Air Corps part of the Army. Well, anyway, we trained all over the United States, mainly in the Southwest, because the weather was better. And my training started, and I went to San Antonio, Texas, and went to pre-flight, and that really was kind of like what you'd say basic training. You learned how to march and how to salute and say yes sir, no sir, and shine your shoes and make your bunk and all those things that the Army considered important. But after we got through the pre-flight, then I went into to radio school, which was up in Scottsfield, Illinois. And that's where we learned to send and receive Morse code, and that's the old did-da-dit-dit-da stuff. And we had to be pretty proficient at it. We had to take 18 5-letter words a minute, which is pretty fast, but we could still write it. You didn't have to typewrite. Now, there were high-speed radio operators that took 45 words a minute, but they used typewriters. But anyway, after my radio operator learning the routine of being a radio operator, we did learn some navigation we did with radio sets. Then we went, after graduation from radio school, I think I was promoted to corporal. That was 2 stripes. And we went off to aerial gunnery school. So we all knew where we were destined. Actually, all the young guys that had good vision and so forth, and were healthy, were probably, 18, 19, 20 years old, were destined to fly because you had to have pretty good health and good vision Well, anyway, we went to gunnery school, and we learned all about 50 caliber machine guns, because most of the planes that we were flying on or would fly on were armed with these big machine guns. And the 50 caliber machine gun shell is about it's almost at least 6 inches long. It's big and powerful, and it comes out of a pretty big gun. So we had to learn all about taking the gun apart and putting it back together and fixing it and so forth. And then we learned to shoot it. Now in aerial gunnery, you got to remember that you are moving and the target you're at is moving, and you have to figure out, you have to lead him, that is, shoot in front of him and let him fly into your bullets, supposedly. Well, we did a lot of practice with what they call skeet. We fired, they fired 12-gauge shotguns, and which were mounted with a ring sight on the end, and we fired at the skeet and learned really to track. That was the idea of moving a gun in a moving vehicle at another moving article. So there were certain formulas you used to fire the gun, which I won't go into now, but they were quite simple. But you learned. So after I finished my my gunnery school, I went to Westover Field, Massachusetts, and there we met our crew. We had a pilot and a co-pilot, a radio operator, an engineer, a navigator, a bombardier, and a nose and tail gunner, and also a ball turret gunner. So when we knew we had a ball turret gunner, we knew that we were getting into a heavy bomber. And so we got on a train and went down to Chatham Field, Georgia, which is right near Savannah, Georgia, right almost on the ocean. And that's where we did our final phase training, and that was operational phase. We flew every day as a crew on an airplane. We practiced all sorts of things, evacuation. In fact, the most exciting thing that happened to me, I think, in all the time I was in the Army, was we were in a mid-air collision with another bomber, and that bomber got cut in half and went into the ground, and all 10 crew members were killed. And our pilot, we lost one engine, the propeller flew off and had a big bent tail, and but the pilot was able to get it back, and we landed. They put a Band-Aid on a couple of our heads, and we got back in the airplane and went up and flew again for 4 hours, so we wouldn't be gun shy, so to speak, the next time we went up. But after we finished our final phase training, we got on a train and we went up to Long Island, which is, you know, off of New York City, and there sat a brand new bomber with 2 hours on its engines. And it was our job to get this airplane from Mitchell Field, New York, on Long Island, over into the European theater of war, where the actual fighting and bombing was going on. So we took this brand new bomber and took it up and flew it around, made sure everything was working right, and then took off and went to New Hampshire, and flew from New Hampshire, if you look on a map, out to Gander, Newfoundland, which is the farthest point east in the northern hemisphere. And we flew from there, from Gander, Newfoundland, down to the Azore Islands, which are basically in the middle of the North Atlantic. We had enough fuel to get there, and we had no problems, although it was exciting. We had a little headwind, and we were a little late getting there. And I remember the pilot told me to get a radio bearing from the Azore Islands, and they said, well, we were right on course, but they said, well, you have a strong headwind, and that may have slowed you down. And that's exactly what had happened. So we landed about a half an hour later, but we were very relieved because that was really our first really over-water flight, and where our navigation had to be good, or we would have been in trouble. We spent the night in the Azore Islands, and the next day we flew to Marrakech, Africa, which is on the northern coast of Africa. Spent a night there, and we flew to Tunisia, which is farther east on the African, down toward the Mediterranean. And from there, the next day we flew up into Italy. So it was obviously that we were destined to be members of the 15th Air Force, which was based in Italy. The 15th Air Force and the 12th Air Force. And the other big air forces, the 8th and the 9th, were based in England. And if you look at a map, the bombers would go from England over into Germany, and they would fly from west to east. And the bombers from Italy were much south of that. We went from south to north. We flew over Romania and Austria and into southern Germany. Even we went to Poland once or twice. In fact, I do remember one thing which I didn't know at the time, but we flew right by these big high smokestacks. And at the briefing, before we took off, the intelligence officer said, we don't know what these big smokestacks are, but there are barracks and people seem to be living down there, so don't by accident drop a bomb, because we don't know what it is. That might be prisoner of war camp, or, well, afterwards, I found out later, 2 years afterwards, we flew by Auschwitz, which was where the Jewish people were being put to death by the Nazis, and were being gassed and incinerated in those big furnaces. But anyway, we saw it, and we could have bombed it just as easily, but we probably would have killed a lot of innocent people who were probably going to die anyway. But anyway, I flew 35 trips from Italy up into the war area. Our biggest worry was the anti-aircraft defense. The Germans were very good at it, and they had a very good weapon, the German 88, they called it, was very accurate. And though we flew at about 25,000 feet, which is about 5 miles up in the air, they were able to shoot us down quite often. I think actually our losses were about 50%. And the unfortunate thing is, a plane might get hit, and everybody was all right, but when the plane crashed, they weren't. If they could get out of the plane and bail and use their parachutes, you had a chance to getting free. That happened. Our navigator was flying one day on another plane as a navigator, and they were shot down over northern Italy, and they jumped out, and he was very upset because he left 3 good cameras in the airplane, which later crashed. And he bailed out and hit the ground and was able to elude the Germans and walked all the way back into Italy, where the American troops were. But it took him about 3 months, and he lost a lot of weight, but we were glad to see him. His name was Tom Beebe, and actually, at the end of the war, he elected to stay in the service, and I think he retired as a general. He went on to become a navigating leader. But anyway, after these 35 missions, we went home by boat, and a couple of interesting things happened. I remember we were waiting to catch the boat in Naples, and that's about the time that President Roosevelt died. He died, I think, the 15th of April. But anyway, we were waiting to get on the boat to go home. And finally the boat came, and the front half of the boat was a hospital ship filled with soldiers who had been up in the mountains fighting and wounded soldiers. And then there were a few Air Corps guys who had finished their missions. And as soon as we finished our missions, they wanted us to get out of there so they could make room for fresh crews to come in. I do remember one funny story. When we were on the boat, the first night out, a voice came over the loudspeaker with all the Air Force personnel report to the stern deck. And it was the lieutenant in charge of the gunnery on this troop ship. And he said, we're short of gunners, and we wanted to get volunteers from you guys who all handle machine guns to work in our gun crews on the way home, in case we were attacked by submarines or something. So anyway, we all volunteered, and so when they blew the whistle for general quarters, we didn't have to go down and get in our bunk down in the hold of the ship. We were able to stay up on the top and at least go up to our gun position. And if the boat got torpedoed, which was the biggest danger, we would probably have a better chance of surviving. I asked, I remember asking the lieutenant who was in charge of the gunnery crew, how come he asked for volunteers from the Air Force? And he said, well, I've been doing this for 3 years, and we've learned that you guys don't get seasick. And it was a very rough trip home, and I think everybody on the boat was seasick just about. But it took us 2 weeks to get back to the United States, and it was very thrilling to go through past the Statue of Liberty and really know that the fighting part of the war was behind us. This could go on, and it went. I was reassigned. I was grounded because I had some problems with my hearing, which I still do, and I was reassigned to a base. I went to a rest hospital first in California with the idea of gaining some weight. I was down to 120 pounds and I should weigh 160. And we had good food there, and I gained the weight, and we went down to Hondo, Texas, to a bomber base, and was assigned the job with another retired navigator of writing the history of the base, because they figured it was going to close one of these days, because very shortly afterwards we dropped the 2 bombs at Hiroshima. And in the meantime, we had conquered the Germans in Italy, in Germany, and actually in Europe. And that war was over. So we could see the end was coming. And it was very, very exciting. But very shortly thereafter, they determined that I had enough points, to get out. That's the years of service, the years of overseas, the months in combat, and all that added up, and I had enough points to get out. So I did, and I was discharged almost 3 years to the day I went in 1942, just around my 21st birthday. And I must add that most people don't realize when we have wars, they're fought by the young people. The young people don't usually have families, and anyway, they're not married, and they're the ones that end up getting shot at and doing the fighting. Also, they are always in better physical shape. So if a war comes along, it's always the young guys that go. You can remember that, and I hope that your generations and the ones to follow can somehow or other skip having these crazy wars. But anyway, I know we're celebrating Veterans Day, and there's a lot of us still left, and I look in the obituaries, the guys in my in my war, there are less and less of us, because I'm 90 now, and I went in when I was 21 or 20, or actually I went in when I was 18, and most of the guys that are 90 but there are not many left. But we still have a lot left over from the Vietnam War and other wars that we've been in over in the Mideast, Iraq, Iran, all that. So it seems that the young people of every generation will be called upon some way or other to defend their country. And whatever way we're called upon, I'm sure your generation will do like ours did, and my father's. My father was in World War I, went overseas and was in the trenches. And you probably have uncles and grandfathers that were in World War II or in Vietnam, which was another very bloody war. So actually the part of being in the service is just service. That's one way I guess we pay for living in a great country like we do. But it's a service that in many ways I learned a great deal, because those were the years I was really growing up. 19 or 18, 19, 20, 21 in those years. So when I got out, I went back to college and finished college, and thanks to the government GI Bill, which paid for our college, and still does, pays for Veterans College. So if you have to go into the service, you'll probably end up with a good education, and probably a field that you'll be interested in.
Well, thank you so much for your service. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.